The team behind Daggerheart is pumping out revisions to the game at a truly astonishing pace. Each subsequent release between versions 1.2 and now 1.4 have been less than a month apart. This is an incredible feat on its own, especially when you consider that they do seem to be actioning genuine feedback from the community on the game. Well, this week I had the chance to play the latest version of Daggerheart, version 1.4, with the same group that I played last time, and for as good as the game is, and for as much potential as I see in it, I feel very comfortable saying now that Daggerheart has an identity crisis. Quick disclaimer before I get into what I'm trying to say, everything that I'm about to mention is intended to be providing feedback to help the game become the best version of itself. Daggerheart is currently in an open beta, with the stated goal being to have players and game masters share their feedback in an effort to improve the game. There's no better time to do this than when the game is in an open beta, with at least a full year before it is officially released. I am not trying to be overly negative or positive here, I'm just providing my insights, hey I said the thing, about my experience with the game so far, and having both played multiple times across different versions, and after spending countless hours going over the playtest manuscripts. I'm not trying to assert that I am definitively correct about anything, but rather just share thoughts and experiences and engage in a discussion about the topic. I would love to see Daggerheart succeed, and I think open feedback is the best way to help make that happen. If I'm having these thoughts and the rest of my playtest group is too, to varying degrees at least, there's a good chance that some amount of other people are too. Alright, so let's get started. Having played and read through all of the previous iterations of the game, it is more clear to me than ever that Daggerheart feels like it's trying to accomplish two almost opposite goals at the same time. To provide a narrative-focused experience that has a strong tactical, almost wargame-inspired element to it. We hear the lead designer Spencer Stark say this in the release video for the 1.3 playtest, where he says, "I would say the other thing to think about, Daggerheart is, where narrative-focused games and tactics, wargame-inspired games hit together, and we're trying to make Daggerheart sit in that space in the middle and provide tools for you to be able to play a narrative-focused game that still has some maps and combat." He goes on to explain how this is one of the challenges in designing the game, in that there are players coming from both sides of that coin, and they're trying to find that correct balance. Now, I do want to be clear in that I do think that this goal is not only admirable, but also very achievable. But what I'm not as confident in is the ability to successfully accomplish that goal in the manner that they're currently trying to. Though I'll get into some more specifics about why specifically I think this later on, to me, right now, at least as we sit in playtest 1.4, it just doesn't feel like the team has a clear vision on the type of game that they're trying to create. And if they don't know, how are we supposed to know? Don't get me wrong, they have a lot of incredible ideas. However, great ideas does not necessarily a great game make. Those ideas need to fit together and flow and feel connected, and like they are all driving towards serving the same fundamental purpose. They all need to coalesce into what feels like Daggerheart. Even if we just look at the "what kind of role-playing game is Daggerheart" section on page 9 of the manuscript, you can probably get an idea of what I'm talking about. In this section, it's clear that they want Daggerheart to be something of a rules medium game. We can see this with statements like, those who prefer a highly strategic, rules-heavy experience with more of a heritage from wargames may find that Daggerheart doesn't have all of the crunchy bits that they're used to, and those who come from very rules-light gameplay might find some mechanics engage in areas where they're used to a more free-form approach. However, they often then describe it at least as being more rules-light, like when they say, the system has a free-flowing approach to combat to avoid stopping down the game into rounds, and it doesn't rely on grid-based movement for the maps and minis. And this is all purposeful in creating a game that utilizes the kind of terrain and map building that miniature-based games are known for, while making Daggerheart streamlined, approachable, and focused on delivering a great narrative experience at the table. And it's the job of the GM, as well as the rest of the players at the table, to prioritize rulings over rules. And then after they say all that, when they talk about how they want Daggerheart to be this kind of rules medium experience, but then kind of describe it as being more rules light, they then simultaneously have some heavy and crunchy rules, like the constant management of hope and fear, armor slots, damage thresholds, which are further subdivided into their 3 component parts, which then need to be managed and considered at each level up and throughout play. Then there's hit points, evasion scores, stress, environments, card management, particularly the once per day cards, and choosing your loadouts. There's just a lot to do. And now, none of these things are inherently bad. They can all be wonderfully detailed and functional systems in their own right, but then the question that I keep coming back to is, are they the right fit for the type of game that Daggerheart is trying to be? The problem though is that I can't answer that question. To me, they don't seem to all work in the type of game that I think Daggerheart is trying to be, but as mentioned, I'm not really convinced that the designers have truly figured out the answer to that question either. To be extra super duper triple clear, that is not meant to be a shot at them. The game is still in early development. The fact that we are even getting to see and experience it at this stage is amazing. But it also means that we get to see a lot of the nitty-gritty stuff that is typically ironed out before a public release. I'm okay with that. That's what beta testing is all about. They know that the game isn't finished, otherwise they would have released it already. In the 1.4 release stream, Spencer and Matt spoke at length about trying to ensure that the game has the right foundation for the future so that it can be supported and enjoyed for years to come. I want that for Daggerheart. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the good and the bad about the game in its current state that make me question its identity. We'll start with some of the good. The way that players are brought into active participation with world building feels incredibly fun, engaging, and impactful. This is a challenging trio to hit, and I think they accomplished it very well. In many TTRPGs, but certainly not all because I know someone's going to comment it, the way that the players are involved in world building is largely by doing something. Their actions have a visceral consequence that led to something changing or happening, but how those actions came to be or the context of the environment itself is something that's often left up to the DM to entirely decide or prepare on their own. And while to some extent this is still true in Daggerheart, what is cool is that players also get to influence world building in real time. I'll give a small example. In our last session, my character has a criminal background and a history with the king in our land, and I've done some fairly shady work for him in the past. Well, when our party ended up meeting the king, our GM, Nathan from D&D Unoptimized, go check him out, passed it off to me to describe the king, how he looks and carries himself. Suddenly, I was in the driver's seat in an otherwise very narrative element that typically your GM would have domain over. What was interesting to me is that after the session, as we all talked about it, no one had expected me to describe the king in the way that I did. They were expecting some Al Pacino-esque mob boss, whereas I described something probably a bit more akin to Ned Stark, and everyone agreed that it ended up having a big impact on how the interaction went, the kinds of things that they were going to do or say, and largely how the entire meeting played out. And sure, of course, you can do that in any game, but the point is just that it feels very right and distinctly Daggerheart to me, and left a very real memory for us. Combining this with the experiences system, which engages a character with their backstory in a more meaningful way and enables them to often have some degree of agency in the types of checks that they're making, is a fun experience. Being the GM, but handing the reins to your players for brief moments during the game feels almost magical in a way. It truly lends itself to the experience that I think Daggerheart is trying to create, which is one that feels truly collaborative and built in the moment during the session, and not being fully written down and memorized by the GM. Stress is also a great mechanic. It's flavorful and interesting and provides unique ways to interact with your character, and also have adversaries interact with you in a way that is immediate and noticeable. I'm loving where it is right now, and I hope that they continue to develop it. Also, monster design of the game, generally speaking, feels good considering where we're at in development. They feel like much more than just bags of hit points. They have interesting features and activated abilities using fear, and can oftentimes genuinely make you concerned about how the encounter is going to go, largely depending on how the group is rolling though. Since we've talked about combat though, let's move on to some of the things that I find challenging or that are getting in the way of the experience. I know I've talked about it before, but I'm going to do it again. Armor, damage thresholds, and hit points. They've made a number of refinements to it over the last few playtests, but what really hit me in our last session is that as good and refined as it can be, I'm just not sure it makes sense in Daggerheart. I won't go into the minute details of it, but as a reminder of how the system works in the game, when an enemy deals damage to you, you can then compare that number to your damage thresholds. You then take an amount of hit points that corresponds to the damage threshold that the attack hit. So if you're a Seraph and you took 9 damage, you would mark 2 hit points. As for armor, each class has an amount of armor slots that they can use. You can reduce incoming damage by an amount equal to the amount of armor slots spent, multiplied by your armor score. So in the same example as a Seraph wearing chainmail, which has an armor score of 6, if you took that same 9 damage, you could spend 1 armor slot to reduce the incoming damage by 6, which then brings it down to 3, which is equal to the Seraph's minor threshold, meaning that they would only take 1 hit point. Or you could spend 2 armor slots, reducing damage to 0, meaning you take no hit points. If that sounds kind of complicated and like a lot, it's because it is. But even if we push the complexity of the system aside for a second, I just don't feel like this concept, no matter how refined, is an appropriate fit for Daggerheart, but hear me out. Remember that this game is trying to facilitate epic battles and the emotional narrative of the characters who fight in them, and a free-flowing approach to combat to avoid stopping down the game into rounds. But this system, as it exists, I feel runs directly counter to those objectives. In Dungeons & Dragons, let's say an enemy deals 57 damage to a character. There's a distinct emotional reaction and response as you watch the DM roll some dice, count up the values, and then tell you just how much damage you took. Even if you're not the character taking the damage, the whole table feels the impact of that damage. It feels real. And sure, you could have some resistance or you succeeded on a save or something, but the number still lingers there and it doesn't stop you from more or less immediately recording how much damage you took. But in Daggerheart, it doesn't feel the same. When everything is an abstraction, you kind of lose the emotional tie to it. When the GM says you take 23 damage, that just doesn't mean anything to anyone. Most groups can't keep track of each other's AC in D&D, they definitely won't be keeping tabs on everyone's damage thresholds and available armor slots. So now the GM tells you that you took 23 damage, so you then stop and compare it against your thresholds, available armor slots, current hit points, and decide whether it's worth spending any or just tanking the full brunt of the hit. The thing is though, that by the time you've made that decision, the emotion of the moment is over, and it's just been reduced down to some math and a quick cost-benefit analysis. Now again, this in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. You're trading the emotional moment for a tactical decision. There is value in that. Some people might absolutely love it and others won't. I can appreciate the tactical element that it brings to the game, but the question that I will ask again is that what Daggerheart is trying to do? I don't think so, but maybe I'm wrong. But this kind of thing is a big element of what I'm talking about when I say that the game has an identity crisis. They want to create a free-flowing, epic, and cinematic battle experience, but I don't know if that's possible with the current armor and damage threshold system. It feels, to me at least, like it gets in the way of the identity and the heart of the game. A system in place can be both good and not suitable to its setting. These are not mutually exclusive. I had a very similar feeling when it came to leveling up my character. There are a lot of choices that you're presented with, but many of them are either necessary or not meaningful. Much of the leveling process to me feels like the illusion of choice. There's a lot of options, but most of them don't really matter. I will say there was an improvement in this regard between 1.3 and 1.4. Now, your damage proficiency automatically scales when you reach certain level breakpoints that coincide with tiers of play. This feels like the right move, as before, I couldn't imagine a world where my warrior wouldn't be upping their damage proficiency, which then effectively reduced my available choices by 1. Again, the illusion of choice. Then there's the question of increasing damage thresholds. Your severe threshold automatically increases during a level up, which seems fine. However, since monster damage also typically scales with the players, what this means is that if you want to keep your relative durability in the same range to prevent you from being effectively weaker, you're almost obliged to increase your other thresholds at the same time, which removes yet another choice. Or you can do what I did, which is to essentially ignore my major and minor thresholds and instead just let my severe threshold get as large as possible and just accept the fact that I will very often be taking 2 damage. What this does though is it resulted in me largely completely disengaging from an entire core mechanic in the game because the choices either feel forced or irrelevant. The same thing kinda goes for Evasion. I've discussed this before, but since the numbers start so low, I feel no incentive to bother increasing it. Whether it's 10 or 11 or 12, I'm still getting hit most of the time, so why bother spending a level up on it? Sure, as long as monster modifiers remain at 0, it can yield a potentially worthwhile benefit, but as many monster modifiers increase to the +2 or +3 or even more range, you're still just getting hit the majority of the time anyway. And I know, a 5% chance is a 5% chance. Yes, I get it. But it still just doesn't feel worth it. I paid attention to all the attack rolls against me in our last session, of which there were about 15. On exactly one roll would me have increasing my evasion made a difference, and since I didn't end up dying, it literally made no difference. And this problem is only compounded by the fact that if you don't do it early, by the time that you get to the later levels, it's essentially impossible to catch up, and because there's so many domain cards that can temporarily increase your evasion or reduce damage at the cost of some hope, again, it just doesn't feel worth engaging with. And of course, you can absolutely create some insane evasion tank and never get hit by anything, but that's what you're dedicating your entire character to doing and not really anything else. The entire point that I'm trying to get at when it comes to leveling up is that there are just a lot of choices presented, which is cool, but many of those choices don't yield impactful changes or benefits to the character, so you end up with systems that often feel not worth it to engage with at all, which is certainly not what the designers are trying to do. In a game that wants to prioritize actually playing the game and focusing on the characters, their growth and development, they should be trying to enable features that are obvious in what they do and what impact they will have on your character. Increasing your hit points by 1, for example, might feel good, but if all it's doing is keeping you at the same effective durability, did you really do anything with your level up? Or did you just prevent yourself from becoming weaker? For anyone who's played Diablo 4 since its release, this was a big part of the same problem that they had. As you leveled up and you increased in power, monsters did too, so you effectively never felt like you gained any power at all. You just stayed at the same relative strength. Yes, you were killing stronger things, but you weren't doing it quicker or more efficiently than when you were level 5. When it comes to hope and fear, I will admit that I conceptually love this idea. These cosmic forces that impact the character's realities is great. However, once again, the implementation just feels at odds with how they talk about how they expect the game to be played. You are constantly spending and gaining hope, using abilities and reminding others to increase their hope, checking if you have available hope. You engage with the system so frequently that it often pulls you out of the moment and has you always wondering, did I remember to add that hope? Or when my party member did that thing, did I take the hope? And you're then flipping through cards to see if you have the necessary hope to spend. You're trying to pick the right one to use in the right moment. If the goal is to be streamlined in narrative and not having players always looking at their character sheet, I'm not sure that this helps sell that. There's almost too many tactile elements of the game, which only compounds when the action tracker comes into play. Speaking of which, this time around we tried the new variant initiative rule, and spoiler, none of us liked it. We all collectively felt that it made combat feel more awkward and clunky, and not the same kind of disjointed that you might get from 5e initiative. It just felt off. I think this might need another revision. It's hard to explain exactly why, but it was something that was experienced by everyone at the table, even our GM. We agreed that the next time we play, we will revert to the standard initiative rules. I sincerely hope it comes across that I am just trying to provide feedback based on my experiences playing Daggerheart. It's entirely possible that you may completely disagree with me about everything that I've said, and I am absolutely fine with that. This isn't about being right or wrong. It's about trying to help a game that is still in the very early stages of development to find its direction to be the best version of itself that it can be. Again, incredible mechanics and systems on their own don't necessarily combine to deliver the exact experience that you're looking for. From where I sit right now, I like the direction that the game is moving in, and I like so many ideas that they have. The team is clearly very talented and creative, and I just hope that they continue to channel those ideas into something that is cohesive and all works together to facilitate the exact type of game that they're trying to achieve.